Here we are in sartorial splendour on the banks of the Yarra, at the mouth of the Yarra. We've got the Westgate Bridge behind us, in front of us. We've got shipping docks, and just for your edification and pleasure, I've organised for a tugboat to come past. Now you will hear the noise of the city, and you will hear the lapping of the water and the seagulls hovering around waiting for lunch. Unfortunately, we didn't bring them any lunch. So unfortunately, Kelly, who's doing this YouTube presentation, will be the meal at the end of the presentation. Now, on a serious matter, well, everything's serious, I want to discuss this concept of a climate emergency, not just in terms of increasing CO2 emissions, but in terms of why we find ourselves in this situation. And I'd like to make an Old Testament biblical analogy to the four horsemen of the apocalypse, but not a biblical apocalypse, but a 21st century apocalypse. You try saying apocalypse and see if you don't get tongue-tied. So you can hear the motorbikes, everything's here. Currently we face as a species, we face four critical issues. One, increasing population growth. We have 7.4 billion people on the planet today, and by 2050 there will be 9 billion people. We currently have cities like Jakarta with over 35,000 people, and Tokyo and Greater Tokyo has over 40 million people, and Jakarta has over 35 million people. Secondly, we've got, as far as population growth is concerned, we have places like Java, which are densely populated, Bangladesh, densely populated. The second issue, and I know you'll find this a little bit radical, we actually live on a planet which is surrounded by a stratosphere, a little blue rim of oxygen. And this is a planet with finite resources. That's right, finite resources. And as the population increases, the demand for resources increases. Now, irrespective of how intelligent our scientists are and artificial intelligence, the dilemma is that the resources are finite. The third issue that we face as a species is the domination of the world economy, and not just the world economy, but the domination of each and every one of us by corporate capitalism. Now, democracy does not equal corporate capitalism. It doesn't even equal capitalism, although a lot of people, in the West think democracy equals corporate capitalism. Corporate capitalism has one function and one function only, and that is to create ever-increasing profits for its major shareholders, irrespective of the human, social, environmental, and national costs to a community. So if you have an economy which is dominated by the needs of corporate capitalism, increasing population growth, finite resources, and then increasing CO2 emissions because of human activity on the planet, we have a major problem. And as we saw in the last few days, with the 300,000 Australians and the millions of people around the world who protested because of the climate emergency, and as we'll continue to see these protests grow, and as we saw at the United Nations Summit, which was held a few days ago, where 60 world leaders, minus Mr. Trump and Mr. Morrison, talked about the need to reduce emissions, as well as people like Greta and other children who raised their concern to world leaders. Now, in Australia, we have a dilemma. We are a country that relies on exports, and coal is a major export driver. And the coal industry, the fossil fuel industry, has an exceptional amount of power, political power. And we're one of the few countries which is not making the necessary effort to address the issue of increasing CO2 emissions. Now, increasing CO2 emissions is not just a scientific term. It's not just a matter of numbers. It's a real problem. It causes increasing temperature. Increasing temperature causes environmental damage. It causes changes in weather patterns. It causes drought. It causes flooding. It causes starvation. It causes the displacement of millions of people across borders, And it's no wonder the Australian Armed Forces has just in the last few days acknowledged that climate change is the major threat facing Australia and the Australian Armed Forces. And they're quite concerned that they actually will not be able to respond to not only the national disasters that will occur in this country as CO2 emissions increase, but the threat of tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, not millions of people seeking refuge as sea levels rise, as disease becomes more virulent, and as people are forced to move in order to survive. So we've got these four major issues. So it's not just a matter of CO2 emissions. It goes back, I think, to the domination of economic activity by a mantra that we must create ever-increasing profits, that we must continue to grow, that it is growth which creates profits, which then rewards us as a species and gives us the resources and the services to prosper and survive. Now, when the children of this planet are beginning to understand what their future looks like, it's not a very pleasant future. It doesn't matter what Mr. Morrison says about increasing anxiety and you don't have to worry because we can find you a poorly paid job, part-time job somewhere. The issue is much, much, much deeper than that. And it's not just a matter of converting capitalism from a fossil fuel-based concept to a green capitalism where they rely on non-fossil fuel methods of energy production. Now that's a nice truck. I'd just like to point that out, that in Australia, it's very interesting, we have a large landmass, but we have no real rail system. And most of our transport is carried out by trucks which rely on diesel fuel. Just an interesting aside. But getting back to what I was saying, so we've got major issues, and these major issues are not just political, they're also economic. Now, for far too long, Australians, as we saw at the last federal election, have not taken the threat of climate change seriously. And even those Australians who take the threat of climate change seriously have seen green capitalism as a saviour, as a way of putting off the ultimate day of reckoning. The four horsemen of the apocalypse and the rapture, the ultimate day of reckoning. The reality is, it's like a drip of water. You've got a drip of water, drip, drip, drip. You do nothing about the drip. It turns into a trickle. You do nothing about the trickle. The trickle turns into a rivulet. The rivulet turns into a river. The river turns into a torrent and destroys everything in front of it. And that's the thing about climate change. We are now reaching a situation, irrespective of what people what I call climate change flat earthers say, and irrespective of the power of the fossil fuel industry, we are now reaching a situation where things may not be able to be turned around without major loss of life. And I'm not talking about a few 100,000 people, I'm talking about tens of millions of people losing the capacity to survive. And those doomsday cultists, find themselves a little hovel somewhere in the desert, may not be far wrong. Not today, but maybe in 20 or 30 years' time. Because if you look at a city like Melbourne, and that's where I'm living currently, with almost over 5 million people, it runs on 2 or 3 days' food supply. If you cut the food supply or the fuel supply, you've got major catastrophic disasters, major disasters. So we are now in a situation where we need, as a people, to make a decision. And if governments and business are not willing to make that decision, we have to force them to make that decision. And if we use the same analogy for the protests which are now occurring as far as climate change is concerned, a drip is slowly turning into a trickle. And that trickle can turn into a rivulet and a river and a torrent. And we can actually clean the planet and change things radically. But instead of having to do things radically, with a large loss of life and large damage and to individuals and communities, and us becoming more entrenched as a community in terms of pushing back asylum seekers and climate refugees. I think we can do this in a more gradual form. And that gradual form is a campaign not just about reducing CO2 emissions, but a campaign about breaking down corporate capitalism. The problem in 2019 in Australia is that most Australians, whether they like it or not, are incorporated into the system through superannuation. There's over $1 trillion of money in superannuation funds today, some industry-based, some not industry-based. But what they all have in common is they invest in the stock market. And what that has done, it has skewed the reason people invest. They don't invest because of value of a particular enterprise. They invest because of different news reports. And as people manipulate the market to suit themselves, what we are seeing is, and as interest rates fall to almost nothing, what we are seeing is more and more elderly people with self-managed funds, and there's over 1 million, and more elderly people in super funds seeing their future whittle away, disintegrate before their eyes. Because what is now happening is that the money which is made by these corporations like BHP doesn't go into expanding the business and employing more people. It goes into paying dividends to shareholders or buying back shares and improving dividends to shareholders. So we have seen a total manipulation of the market system by unaccountable corporations who dominate the parliamentary agenda. And they dominate the parliamentary agenda in a number of ways. Now, when you elect a representative to Parliament, you give them a signed blank cheque to make decisions for you for the next 3 years at a federal level and 4 years at most state levels. It's a signed blank cheque. On the other side of the ledger, what you have is these powerful forces who are trying to manipulate the parliamentary agenda to suit their bottom line, to suit their profitability, to ensure that their businesses continue to flourish irrespective of the damage they are doing to the Australian population. And when you realise that most of our natural resources, the exploitation of these natural resources is being exploited by private companies who only pay back through a small amount of taxation and occasionally small royalty payments, you realise that they have an extraordinary amount of power. It's no accident that Mr. Morrison has taken these so-called leaders with him to the United States for so-called business discussions with other millionaires and multi-millionaires in the United States. So it's more than just CO2 emissions. It's what is creating CO2 emissions, what are the pressures we face. And so the struggle against global emergency, the struggle against climate change and climate emergency is not just a struggle to decrease CO2 emissions. It is a struggle against corporate capitalism. It is a struggle against the domination of the economic system by a small cartel of individuals who manipulate governments, sovereign governments, to suit their bottom line. It's a struggle for more democracy, not less democracy. What I mean by more democracy is the fact there is no crisis of democracy. There may be a crisis of parliamentary democracy. There is a crisis of parliamentary democracy where people have lost faith in parliamentary system because the parliamentary system is not able to deliver what people expect the state to deliver. I mean, I could look at many parameters like Medicare, public education, public health, pharmaceutical industries, food production, the domination of all these areas by small corporations and how they manipulate the marketplace. But the bottom line is, as long as they are allowed to manipulate the marketplace to improve their bottom line, and as long as we follow the growth for growth's sake's mantra, there will be no solution to the problem of CO2 emissions. And that's why it's important to remember the four horsemen of the apocalypse are not just some airy-fairy biblical annotation which has nothing to do with 21st century society. It's a real issue because increasing temperatures will cause hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of deaths. It'll cause increased disease. It'll cause dislocation of communities. Most of our major cities are below below about 10 metres above sea level because we're a port-based community because the colonisation process, it was ports which were colonised. So we have to integrate the struggle against corporate capitalism with the struggle to decrease CO2 emissions. They go hand in hand. If we didn't have our economy and our political system dominated by that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, we would not find ourselves facing a climate emergency in 2019. So if you're involved in that struggle, and I assume most of the people watching this will be involved in that struggle, remember, it's a twin struggle. It's a struggle against corporate capitalism, is fully integrated with the struggle to reduce CO2 emissions. You can't have one without the other. Next week, I'm going to talk about terrorism. That's right, terrorism.